The Greek Way to Western Civilization by Edith Hamilton, Chapter 10, Xenophon, the Ordinary Athenian Gentleman. To turn from Thucydides to Xenophon is a pleasant but surprising experience. The lives of the two men overlapped, although Xenophon was much the younger. Both were Athenians and soldiers. Both lived through the war and saw the defeat of Athens. Yet they inhabited different worlds so different they seemed to have no connection with each other. Thucydides's world was a place racked and ruined and disintegrated by war, where hope was gone and happiness was unimaginable. Xenophon's was a cheerful place with many nice people in it and many agreeable ways of passing the time. There was hunting, for instance. He writes a charming essay about it, of the delights of the early start in winter over the snow, to track the hare with hounds as keen for the chase as their masters, in spring, when the fields are so full of wildflowers the scent for the dogs is poor. Or a deer may be the quarry, first-rate sport, or a wild boar, dangerous but delightfully exciting. Such rewards, too, as the hunter has. He keeps strong and young far longer than other men. He is braver and even more trustworthy, although why that should be our author does not trouble to explain. A hunting man just is better than one who does not hunt, and that is all there is to it. Ask any fox-hunting squire. In English literature, hunting is a good, healthy, honest pleasure, and a young man is lucky if he takes to it. It will save him from city vices and incline him to love virtue. Well, you definitely want to eat the animal or have someone else eat the animal that's been hunted, and so only good meat should be. Although some animals become a danger and they have to be hunted out of a certain area, which isn't as common as it's reported that they have to be hunted out of an area. But, at what period in Thucydides's history were the Athenians going a-hunting? One wonders. Did that man of tragic vision ever watch a hunt? Did he ever listen to stories about the size of the boar that had been killed? Was he ever at a dinner party where any stories were told over the wine? The imagination fails before the attempt to put him there. Even if Socrates had been a guest, as he was at a dinner, Xenophon went to and reported. It followed more closely, we must suppose, the fashion of the day for such parties than did Plato's famous supper at Agathon's house, where conversation was the only entertainment. Agathon's guests were the elite of Athens and wanted a lofty discourse for their diversion. The guests at Xenophon's dinner, except for himself and Socrates, were ordinary people who would quickly have been bored by the speeches in the symposium, but no one could possibly have been bored at the party Xenophon describes. It was, from first to last, a most enjoyable occasion. There was some good talk at the table, of course. Socrates would see to that, and now and then the discourse turned to matters sober enough to have engaged even Thucydides's attention. But, for the most part, it was light-hearted, as befitted a good dinner. There was a great deal of laughter, when, for instance, Socrates defended his flat nose as being preferable to a straight one, and when a man newly married refused the onions. There was music too, and Socrates obliged with a song, to the delighted amusement of the others. Now, onions originally came from northwest Africa, but they had spread to Greece and stuff like that. via the Mediterranean. A pleasant interlude was afforded by a happy boy, and Xenophon's description reveals his power of keen observation and quick sympathy. The lad had been invited to come with his father, a great honor, but he had just won the chief contest for boys at the principal Athenian festival. He sat beside his father, regarded very kindly by the company. They tried to draw him out, but he was too shy to speak a word until someone asked him what he was most proud of, and someone else cried, "Oh, his victory, of course." At this he blushed and blurted out, "No, I'm not." All were delighted to have him finally say something, and they encouraged him. "No, but what are you proudest then?" "Oh, my father," he said, and pressed closer to him. "It is an attractive picture of Athenian boyhood in the brilliant, corrupt city where Thucydides could find nothing good. As was usual, entertainment had been provided for the guests. A girl did some diverting and surprising feats. The best turn was when she danced and kept 12 hoops whirling in the air, catching and throwing them in perfect time with the music. Watching her with great attention, Socrates declared that he was forced to conclude, not only from this girl, my friends, but from other things too, that a woman's talent is not at all inferior to a man's. A pleasant thing to know, he added, if any of them wanted to teach something to his wife. A murmur passed around the table. Xanthippe, and one of the company ventured. I don't have the Greek for other than Xenophon. "Why do you not then teach good temper to yours?" Because Socrates retorted, "My great aim in life is to get on well with people, and I choose Xanthippe because I knew if I could get on with her, I could with anyone." The explanation was unanimously voted satisfactory. A little desultory talk followed that finally turned upon exercise, and Socrates said, to the intense delight of all, that he danced every morning in order to reduce. "It's true," one of the others broke in. "I found him doing it, and I thought he'd gone mad. But he talked to me, and I tell you, he convinced me. When I went home, will you believe it, I did not dance. I don't know how, but I waved my arms about. There was a general outcry. 'Oh, Socrates, let us see you too.' By this time, the dancing girl was turning somersaults and leaping headfirst into a circle formed by swords. This displeased Socrates. No doubt it is a wonderful performance, he conceded, but pleasure in watching a lovely young creature exposing herself to danger like that, I don't find it agreeable." The others agreed, and a pantomime between the girl and her partner, a graceful boy, was quickly substituted. The rescue of the forsaken Ariadne by Bacchus. It was performed to admiration. Not a word was spoken by the two actors, but such was their skill that by gestures and dancing they expressed all the events and emotions of the story with perfect clarity to the spectators. I think the Church of Hermetic Sciences, or is it under their name Ordo Templi Astartes, have a Mass of the Elements, and they do this wordless, but it's so, symbolic that you get it. They seemed not actors who had learned their parts, but veritable lovers. With that, the party broke up, Socrates walking home with the nice boy and his father of himself. Xenophon says nothing throughout the essay except at the very beginning, when he explains that he was one of the guests and decided to give an account of the dinner because he thought what honorable and virtuous men did in their hours of amusement had its importance. One had only regret that so few Greek writers agreed with him. Another pleasant picture he gives of domestic Athens has an interest not only as a period piece, but because it shows a glimpse of that person so elusive in all periods. The woman of ancient Greece, a man lately married, talks about his wife. She was not yet 15, he says, and had been admirably brought up to see as little and hear as little and ask as few questions as possible. The young husband had the delightful prospect of inscribing on this blank page whatever he chose. There was no doubt in his mind what he should start with. Of course, Xenophon reports him as saying, I had to give her time to grow used to me, but when we had reached a point where we could talk easily together, I told her she had great responsibilities. I took up with her what I expected of her as a housekeeper. She said wonderingly, but my mother told me I was of no consequence, only you. All I had to do, she said, was to be sensible and careful. Her husband was quick to seize the cue. Kindly but weightedly, he explained to the young thing that her life henceforth was to be a perpetual exercise in carefulness and good sense. She would have to keep stock of everything brought into the house, oversee all the work that went on, superintend the spinning, the weaving, the making of clothes, train the new servants, and nurse the sick. At this point, the girl's spirit seemed to have risen a little, for she murmured that she thought she would like to take care of sick people, but her husband kept steadily on. Of course, she would stay indoors. He himself enjoyed starting the day with a long ride into the country, very helpful as well as very pleasant, but for a woman to be roaming abroad was most discreditable. However, she could get plenty of exercise at the loom, or making beds, or supervising the maids. Kneading bread was said to be as good exercise as one could find. All that sort of thing would improve her health and help her complexion, very important in keeping herself attractive to her husband. Artificial substitutes were no good. Husbands always liked to know when their wives painted. Oh, they always knew when their wives painted, and they never liked it. Well, it hurts the health overall. And why are they painting for everybody else, and when they get home, the mess on the pillow and all that? Red and white stuff on the face was disgusting when a man was aware of it, as a husband must be. The essay ends happily with the declaration, ever since my wife has done in all respects just as I taught her. Now, most religions actually condemn the, dyeing of the white hair and the wigs and the makeup and all that sort of stuff. It is hard to fit the beautiful young wife and happily important husband and their immaculate household into Thucydides' Athens, as it is to put Thucydides himself at the table beside Socrates, watching the girl with the hoops. There is no use trying to make a composite picture out of Xenophon and Thucydides. The only result would be to lose the truth on each side. Thucydides' truth was immeasurably more profound. In life's uneasy panorama, he could discover unchanging verities. He could probe to the depths of the evils of his time and perceive them all grounded in the never-varying evils of human nature. In Sparta's victory over Athens, he saw what the decision of war was worth as a test of values, and that war would forever decide matters of highest importance to the world if men continued to be governed by greed and the passion for power. What he knew was truth indeed, with no shadow of turning and inexpressibly sad. But Xenophon's truths were true too. There were pleasant parties and well-ordered homes and nice lads and jolly hunters in war-racked Greece. History never takes account of such pleasantries, but they have their importance. The Greek world would have gone insane if Thucydides' picture had been all-inclusive. Of course, Xenophon's mind was on an altogether lower level. Eternal truths were not in his line. The average man in Periclean Athens can be seen through Xenophon's eyes as he cannot be through Thucydides' or Plato's. In Xenophon, there are no dark greed-ridden schemers such as Edith saw in Athens. Neither are there any Platonic idealists. The people in his books are ordinary, pleasant folk, not given to extremes in any direction, and convincingly real, just as Xenophon himself is. Here is a picture he draws of one of them. He said that he had long realized that unless we know what we ought to do and try our best to do it, God has decided that we have no right to be prosperous. If we are wise and do take pains, he makes some of us prosperous, although not all. So, to start with, I reverence him, and then do all I can to be worthy when I pray, to be given health and strength of body, and the respect of the Athenians, and the affection of my friends, and an increase of wealth with honor, and safety in war with honor. These eminently sensible aspirations strike a true Greek note. The man who uttered them and the man who recorded them were typical Athenian gentlemen. What Xenophon was comes through clearly in his writings. A man of good will and good sense, kindly, honest, pious, intelligent too, interested in ideas, not the purely speculative kind, rather those that could be made to work towards some rational, practical good. His friends were like him. They were representative Athenians of the better sort. In another way, too, Xenophon represented his times. His life shows the widely separated interests and varied occupations which made the Periclean Athens different from other men. As a young man, he came to Athens from his father's estate in Attica to be educated out of country ways. He joined the circle around Socrates, where young and old alike were, as Plato puts it, possessed and maddened with the passion for knowledge, or as he himself states, wanting to become good and fine men, and learn their duty to their family, their servants, their friends, and their country. The Socrates he listened to did not like Plato's Socrates. Discourse upon the glorious sights of justice and wisdom and truth the enraptured soul beholds, shining in pure light, or anything like that. This, Socrates, was a soberly thinking man, distinguished for common sense, and in Xenophon's record of him, the memorabilia, what he chiefly does for his young friends is to give them practical advice on how to manage their affairs. A budding officer is told the way to make his men efficient soldiers. A conscientious lad, burdened with many female relatives, is shown how they can be taught to support themselves, and so on. While Xenophon listens entranced by such serviceable wisdom, how long Xenophon lived this delightful life of conversation is not known, but he was still young when he left it for the very opposite kind of life, that of a soldier. He was truly a man of his times, when poets and dramatists and historians were soldiers and generals and explorers. In his campaigns, he traveled far and saw the great world. He also got enough money to live on for the rest of his days by capturing and holding for ransom a rich Persian noble. Then he went back to Greece, but to Sparta, not Athens. Curiously, although he has left in his Anabasis an unsurpassing picture of what the democratic ideal can accomplish, he was himself no democrat. He came of a noble family, and all his life kept the convictions of his class. He always loved Sparta and distrusted Athens. Even so, in the great crisis of his life, when he and his companions faced imminent destruction, he acted like a true Athenian, who knew what freedom was and what free men could achieve. When the 10,000 elected him general, in order to get them out of their terrible predicament, he never tried out any Spartan ideas on them. He became as democratic a leader as there could possibly be of the freest democracy conceivable. The fact that the astonishing success which resulted had no permanent effect upon his point of view should not be surprising. A converted aristocrat is a rare figure in history. Xenophon never went back to Athens. Indeed, a few years after his return to Greece, he was fighting on the Spartan side against her and was declared an exile. The Spartans gave him an estate in the pleasant country near Olympia, where he lived for many years, riding and hunting and farming. A model country gentleman. Here he wrote a great many books on subjects as far apart as the dinner Socrates attended and the proper management of the Athenian revenues. With 2 or 3 exceptions, the writings are quite pedestrian, sensible, straightforward, clearly written, but no more. There are a few sentences, however, scattered through them which show a surprising power of thought and far-reaching vision. Although, or perhaps because he had thought much, he believed that peace should be the aim of all states. Diplomacy, he says, is the way to settle disputes, not war. He urges Athens to use her influence to maintain peace, and he suggests making Delphi a meeting place for the nations, where they can talk out their differences. He who conquers by force, he says, may fancy that he can continue to do so, but the only conquests that last are when men willingly submit to those who are better than themselves. The only way really to conquer a country is through generosity. The world has not yet caught up with Xenophon. His best book, however, the book he really lives by, is on war. It is, of course, the Anabasis, the Retreat of the 10,000, a great story and of great importance for our knowledge of the Greeks. No other piece of writing gives so clear a picture of Greek individualism, that instinct which is supremely characteristic of ancient Greece, and decided the course of the Greek achievement. It was the cause or the result, as one chooses to look at it, of the Greek love for freedom. A Greek had a passion for being left free to live his life in his own way. He wanted to act by himself and think for himself. It did not come natural to him to turn to others for direction. He depended upon his own sense of what was right and true. Indeed, there was no generally acknowledged source of direction anywhere in Greece except the oracles, difficult to reach and still more difficult to understand. Athens had no authoritarian church or state either, to formulate what a man should believe and to regulate the details of how he should live. There was no agency or institution to oppose his thinking in any way he chose on anything whatsoever. As for the state, it never entered an Athenian's head that it could interfere with his private life, that it could see, for instance, that his children were taught to be patriotic, or limit the amount of liquor he could buy, or compel him to save for his old age. Everything like that a citizen of Athens had to decide himself and take full responsibility for. The basis of the Athenian democracy was the conviction of all democracies that the average man can be depended upon to do his duty and to use good sense in doing it. Trust the individual was the avowed doctrine in Athens, and expressed or unexpressed, it was common to Greece. Sparta we know as the exception, and there must have been other backwaters. Nevertheless, the most reactionary Greek might at any time revert to type. It is on record that Spartan soldiers abroad shouted down an unpopular officer, threw stones at a general whose orders they did not approve, in an emergency put down incompetent leaders and acted for themselves. Even the iron discipline of Sparta could not completely eradicate the primary Greek passion for independence. A people ruling, says Herodotus, the very name of it is so beautiful. In Aeschylus's play about the defeat of the Persians at Salamis, the Persian queen asks, "Who is set over the Greeks as despots?" And the proud answer is, "They are the slaves and vassals of no man." Therefore, all Greeks believed they conquered the slave subjects of the Persian tyrant. Free men, independent men, were always worth inexpressibly more than men submissive and controlled. We're all submissive and controlled to something, right? Even if it seems we're wild. Military authorities have never advocated this point of view, but how applicable it is to soldiers too is shown for all time by the Anabasis. The 10,000 got back safely after one of the most perilous marches ever undertaken, just because they were not a model, disciplined army, but a band of enterprising individuals. The epic of the retreat begins in a camp beside a little town in Asia, not far from Babylon. There, more than 10,000 Greeks were gathered. They had come from different places. One of the leaders was from Thessaly, another from Boeotia. The commander-in-chief was a Spartan. On his staff was a young civilian from Athens named Xenophon. They were soldiers of fortune, a typical army of mercenaries. Yeah, nowadays we have that problem is that people get into the army as a job rather than a cause. Who had gone abroad because there was no hope of employment at home. Greece was not at war for the moment. A Spartan peace was over the land. It was the summer of 401 BC. 3 years after the fall of Athens. Persia, however, was a hotbed of plots and counterplots that were bringing a revolution near. The late king's 2 sons were enemies, and the younger planned to take the throne from his brother. This young man was Cyrus. In Persian, it's Kurash. Named for the great Cyrus, the conqueror of Babylon 150 years earlier. His namesake is famous for one reason only, because when he marched into Persia, Xenophon joined his army. If that had not happened, he would be lost in the endless list of little Asiatic royalties, forever fighting for no purpose of the slightest importance to the world. As it is, he lives in Xenophon's pages, gay and gallant and generous. Careful for his soldiers' welfare, sharing their hardships, always first in the fighting, a great leader. The 10,000 had enlisted under his banner with no clear idea of what they were to do beyond the matter of real importance: get regular pay and enough food. They earned their share of both in the next few months. They marched from the Mediterranean through sandy deserts far into Asia Minor, living on the country, which generally meant a minimum of food and occasionally none at all. There was a large Asiatic contingent, 100,000 strong at the least, but they play very little part in the Anabasis. The Greeks are the real army Cyrus depends upon. As Xenophon tells the story, they won the day for him when he met the king's forces. The Battle of Canaxa was a decisive victory for Cyrus. Only he himself was dead, killed in the fighting as he struck at his brother and wounded him. With his death, the reason for the expedition ceased to exist. The Asiatic forces melted away. The little Greek army was alone in the heart of Asia, in an unknown country swarming with hostile troops, with no food, no ammunition, and no notion how to get back. Soon there were no leaders either. The chief officers went to a conference with the Persians under a safe conduct. Their return, eagerly awaited, was alarmingly delayed, and all eyes were watching for them, when in the distance one man all alone, was seen advancing very slowly. A Greek by his dress. They ran to meet him and caught him as he fell, dying, terribly wounded. He could just gasp out that all the others were dead, assassinated by the Persians. That was a terrible night. The Persian plan was clear. In their experience, leaderless men were helpless. Killed officers, and the army would be a lot of sheep waiting to be slaughtered. The only thing wrong with the idea was that this was a Greek army. Xenophon, all his friends dead, wandered away from the horrified camp, found a quiet spot and fell asleep. He dreamed a dream. He saw a thunderbolt of Zeus fall on his home and a great light shine forth. And he awoke with absolute conviction that Zeus had chosen him to save the army. On fire with enthusiasm, he called a council of the under-officers who had not gone to the conference. There, young and a civilian, he stood up and addressed them, hardened veterans all. He told them to throw off despair and show some superiority to misfortune. He reminded them that they were Greeks, not to be cowed by mere Asiatics. Something of his own fire was communicated to them. He even got them laughing. One man who stubbornly objected to everything and would talk only of their desperate case, Xenophon, advised reducing to the ranks and using to carry baggage. He would make an excellent mule. He told his appreciative audience they elected him unanimously to lead the rear, and then had the General Assembly sounded so that he could address the soldiers. He gave them a rousing talk. Things were black and might seem hopeless to others, but they were Greeks, free men living in free states, born of free ancestors. The enemy they had to face were slaves, ruled by despots, ignorant of the very idea of freedom. They think we are defeated because our officers are dead and our good old General Clericus, but we will show them that they have turned us all into generals. Instead of one Clericus, they have 10,000 Clericuses against them. He won them over, and that very morning the 10,000 generals started the march back. They had only enemies around them, not one man they could trust as a guide, and there were no maps in those days and no compasses. One thing only they were sure of: they could not go back by the way they had come. Wherever they had passed, the food was exhausted. They were forced to turn northward and follow the course of the rivers up to the mountains where the Tigris and the Euphrates rise, through what is today the wilds of Kurdistan and the highlands of Georgia and Armenia, all inhabited by savage mountain tribes. These were their only source of provisions. If they could not conquer their strongholds and get at their stores, they would starve. Mountain warfare of the most desperate character awaited them, waged by an enemy who knew every foot of the country, who watched for them on the heights above narrow valleys and rolled masses of rocks down on them, whose sharpshooters attacked them hidden in thickets on the opposite bank of some torrential icy river, while the Greeks searched desperately for a ford. As they advanced ever higher into the hills, they found bitter cold and deep snow, and their equipment was designed for the Arabian desert. So an area where getting below 55, even in the depths of winter, is rare. Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what part of the Arabian desert, but there are parts there that the record low ever recorded is like 54 degrees or something. Probably anyone today, considered their plight, would conclude that their only chance of safety would lie in maintaining strict discipline, abiding by their excellent military tradition, and obeying their leaders implicitly. The chief leaders, however, were dead. Mountain fighting against savages was not a part of their military tradition. Above all, being Greeks, they did not incline to blind obedience in desperate circumstances. In point of fact, the situation which confronted them could be met only by throwing away the rules and regulations that had been drilled into them. What they needed was to draw upon all the intelligence and power of initiative every man of them possessed. They were merely a band of mercenaries, but they were Greek mercenaries, and the average of intelligence was high. The question of discipline among 10,000 generals would otherwise certainly have been serious and might well have proved fatal, but no less than our westward-faring pioneer ancestors who resembled them. They understood the necessity of acting together, not as soldier, but knew what it would mean to have disorder added to the perils they faced. Their discipline was a voluntary product, but it worked. When the covered wagons made their way across America, any leader that arose did so by virtue of superior ability, which men in danger always follow willingly. The leaders of the 10,000 got their posts in the same way. The army was keen to perceive a man's quality, and before long the young civilian Xenophon was practically in command. Each man, however, had a share in the responsibility. Once Xenophon sent out a reconnoitering force to find a pass through the mountains, he told them, "Every one of you is the leader." At any crisis, an assembly was held, the situation explained, and full discussion invited. Whoever has a better plan, let him speak. Our aim is the safety of all, and that is the concern of all. The case was argued back and forth, then put to the vote, and the majority decided. Incompetent leaders were brought to trial. The whole army sat as judges, and acquitted or punished. It reads like a caricature, but there has never been a better vindication of the average man when he is up against it. The 10,000 judges, which the 10,000 generals turned into on occasion, never so far as Xenophon's record goes, passed an unjust sentence. On one occasion, Xenophon was called to account for striking a soldier. "I own that I did so," he said. "I told him to carry to camp a wounded man, but I found him bearing him still alive. I have struck others too, half-frozen men who were sinking down in the snow to die, worn-out men lagging behind where the enemy might catch them. A blow would often make them get up and hasten. Those I have given offense to now accuse me, but those I have helped in battle, on the march, in cold and sickness, none of them speak up. They do not remember. And yet, surely it is better and happier too to remember a man's good deeds than his evil deeds." Upon this, the narrative goes on, the assembly, calling the past to mind, rose up, and Xenophon was acquitted. Now, if you focus on relating the stories of the righteous past, well, those stories can be used to teach the future. And you definitely want the legacy of good to go on better. This completely disarming speech for the defense shows how well Xenophon knew the way to manage men. There is wounded feeling in his words, but no anger, no resentment, above all, no self-righteousness. Those listening were convinced by his frankness, of his honesty, reminded without a suggestion of boasting how great his services had been, and given to understand that far from claiming to be faultless, he appealed to them only to remember his deserts as well as his mistakes. He understood his audience and the qualities a leader must have, at least any leader who would lead Greeks. In a book he wrote on the education of the great Cyrus, he draws a picture of the ideal general, which, absurd as it is when applied to an oriental monarch, shows to perfection the Greek idea of the one method that will make men who are worth anything independent, self-reliant men willing to follow another man. The leader, he writes, must himself believe that willing obedience always beats forced obedience, and that he can get this only by really knowing what should be done. Thus, he can secure obedience from his men because he can convince them that he knows best, precisely as a good doctor makes his patients obey him. Also, he must be ready to suffer more hardships than he asks of his soldiers, more fatigue, greater extremes of heat and cold. No one, Cyrus always said, can be a good officer who does not undergo more than those he commands. However that may be, it is certain that the inexperienced civilian Xenophon could have won over the 10,000 in no other way. He was able to convince them that he knew best, and they gave up their own ideas and followed him willingly. He showed them, too, that even if they made him their leader, it was share and share alike between him and the army. On one occasion, when he was riding up from his post in the rear to consult with the van, and the snow was deep and the marching hard, a soldier cried to him, "Oh, it is easy enough for you on horseback." Xenophon leaped from his horse, flung the man aside, and marched in his place. So, a little bit different than what Napoleon did. Didn't Napoleon take double rations and let people die? But then again, that's how he survived, and possibly everybody, But, yeah, this is what a leader's supposed to do. They're supposed to actually share with their people, right? Because a lot of people think about, politics and being a general and all the rest of it is to get richer than the rest of the people. That's, there's a problem with that. That's why people think power corrupts. Always, no matter how desperate things seemed, the initiative, which only free men can be counted on to develop, got them through. They abandoned their baggage by common consent and threw away their loot. "We will make the enemy carry our baggage for us," they said. "When we have conquered them, we can take what we want." Early in the march, they were terribly harassed by the Persian cavalry because they had none of their own. The men of Rhodes could throw with their slings twice as far as the Persians. They set them on baggage mules, directed them to aim at the riders, but spare their mounts and bring them back. And from that time on, the Persians kept them in horses. If they needed ammunition, they sent bowmen who could shoot farther than the foe to draw down showers of arrows that fell short and could easily be collected. One way or another, they forced the Persians into service. When they got to the hills, they discarded the tactics they had been trained in. They gave up the solid line, the only formation they knew, and the army advanced by columns sometimes far apart. It was merely common sense in the rough, broken country, but that virtue belongs peculiarly to men acting for themselves. The disciplined military mind has never been distinguished for it. To be a disciplined person for a cause and under authority and still, for choice, but yeah, coerced and forced, it just lacks the merit. That's why religious coercion and forced conversion and stuff doesn't, why it's not allowed. Well, some societies allow it, but, So, always cold and sometimes freezing, always hungry and sometimes starving, and always fighting, they held their own. No one, by now, had any clear idea where in the world they were. One day, Xenophon, riding in the rear, putting his horse up a steep hill, heard a great noise in front. A tumult was carried back to him by the wind, loud cries and shouting, an ambush, he thought, and calling to the others to follow at full speed, he drove his horse forward. No enemy was on the hilltop, only the Greeks. They were standing, all faced the same way, with tears running down their faces, their arms stretched out to what they saw before them. The shouting swelled into a great roar. The sea, the sea! They were home at last. The sea was home to a Greek. It was the middle of January. They had left Canaxa on the 7th of September. In 4 months, they had marched well on to 2,000 miles in circumstances never surpassed before or since for hardship and danger. The Anabasis is the story of the Greeks in miniature. 10,000 men, fiercely independent by nature, in a situation where they were a law unto themselves, showed that they were preeminently able to work together and proved what miracles of achievement willing cooperation can bring to pass. The Greek state, at any rate the Athenian state, which we know best, showed the same. What brought the Greeks safely back from Asia was precisely what made Athens great. The Athenian was the law unto himself, but his dominant instinct to stand alone was counterbalanced by his sense of overwhelming obligation to serve the state. This was his own spontaneous reaction to the facts of his life, nothing imposed upon him from outside. The city was his defense. In a hostile world, his security, his pride too. The guarantee to all of his worth as an Athenian. Plato said that men could find their true moral development only in service to the city. The Athenian was saved from looking at his life as a private affair. Our word idiot comes from the Greek name for the man who took no share in public matters. Pericles, in the funeral oration reported by Thucydides, says, "We are a free democracy, but we are obedient. We obey the laws, more especially those which protect the oppressed, and the unwritten laws whose transgression brings acknowledged shame. We do not allow absorption in our own affairs to interfere with participation in the cities. We differ from other states in regarding the man who holds aloof from public life as useless, yet we yield to none in independence of spirit and complete self-reliance. This happy balance was maintained for a very brief period. No doubt, at its best, it was as imperfect as the working out of every lofty idea in human terms is bound to be. Even so, it was the foundation of the Greek achievement. The creed of democracy, spiritual and political liberty for all, and each man a willing servant of the state, was the conception which underlay the highest reach of Greek genius. It was fatally weakened by the race for money and power in the Periclean age. The Peloponnesian War destroyed it, and Greece lost forever. Nevertheless, the idea of free individuals, unified by a spontaneous service to common life, was left as a possession to the world, never to be forgotten. And so in some ways, that's similar to the goal of the fourth political theory of Alexander Dugin.